Good morning, everyone, and welcome to DNA Behavior. We'll get started here momentarily, but welcome to our Behaviorally Smart Team Performance webinar with your hosts, Leon Morales, our Chief Relationship Officer, and myself, Trip Rockwell, our Marketing Officer. And just so you know, this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of it will be distributed amongst all registrants and attendees. At the conclusion, there's also a survey at the end that we encourage you guys to fill out. It will include our unlocking guide as a freebie giveaway, a little more insight as to who we are and what we do around behavioral insights and personalities and applying them to your day-to-day and your businesses. So without further ado, also know any questions will be promptly responded to and shared with the all attendees as the case may be. Everyone will be on mute so that it doesn't get too much crosstalk as Leon and I deliver the content, and then we will also host a number of poll questions to keep things moving right along and keep people engaged and make sure that we're all up to speed. So without further ado, we will let the good times roll. Thank you.
Thank you, Trip. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for the Behaviorally Smart Team Performance. And my name is Leon Morales. I'm the Chief Relationship Officer here at DNA Behavior. I've been with DNA Behavior for almost 5 years. So this is an area that I have a lot of expertise. I do a lot of work with firms around team performance. So Trip and I have agreed that we would do a series of Behaviorally Smart Team Performance over the next 4 months. And so this is really the first stage of what we'll talk about today, and it's going to focus mostly on sort of the forming of a team. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about behavioral insights and how they impact teams. So with that, a couple of housekeeping items. Just want to make sure there is a chat box that Trip mentioned. We would welcome any questions that you have on the presentation or any materials. Trip mans that. He sort of answers questions as we go. Occasionally we might have one question that really is relevant for the entire group, which we'll share at the end of the presentation. And then as we go through this, we'll make sure that we keep it to about 50 minutes, and that'll give you a little bit of time if there's Q&A. And then you will receive the call recording probably around later this afternoon, probably about 4 hours later. And then you will follow it up with a PDF version of this presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. My name again is Leon Morales. Here's my contact information. Also, Trip's our Chief Marketing Officer, and his email is there as well. So we'll talk really around what Business DNA is, the behavioral intelligence platform, sort of managing human capital. We all know that sort of an organization exists really around people, also products, but our focus here is really around understanding and leveraging the human talent in a business. That's really the focus of what we'll talk about today, and sort of understanding that behavioral, that communication, that learning style around that hardwired behavior. And it really does start with self-awareness and understanding really around what my strengths are as an individual and how it can be, and how it can be used with other team members, and what it sort of the effect in the workplace that my behavior has. And then how do you become a leader using these sort of insights can be quite impressive around how do you adapt the style around that. And we'll get into a little around what we call learned and natural behavior. And then leveraging the team differences to drive better results and minimize stress. And then number 5, resolving conflict, uncovering any critical items that are sort of there as a team, and we find that to be true in sort of a number of the engagements we work in. And then 6, improving client service, sort of through sort of team cohesiveness. So those are 6 points we'll cover through this presentation. And here we have sort of the performance gap, which is a 2009 Gallup research sort of study around when teams really don't have strong sort of behaviors on the team, you have a lot of productivity loss. But if you actually have a greater understanding of how the team is wired, how they're wired for results, or how they're wired for relationships, you can get upwards of 70% team productivity gains. That may sound really high, but if you think about it, if you've ever worked on a project in your firm that didn't sort of achieve the results that it was intending to, or you actually had to abandon the project, you can see where if you do understand the behavioral insights of the team and you actually deliver on time, on budget, that you can really justify those 70% team productivity gains. So here's an interesting stat around 87% of business issues are really communication related. And it really does make sense. And this is a Harvard study done in 2002, that if you've ever worked with an individual and you just don't understand them, they sort of need a little bit more sort of instructions through the process versus you're a little bit more of a higher level manager or individual that you just get sort of high points. You know, you're expecting that other team member to sort of understand sort of what needs to get done, and they just don't have the experience or the aptitude to do that. And that's really what can happen in that 87% of sort of the misfires. It really is related to just the communication patterns and needs of the other individual. So we're talking now about natural behavior. So we're gonna have two distinct sort of discussions around what natural behavior is and then what learned behavior is. Our focus today is really around natural behavior. So if a person actually takes what we call natural behavior discovery, which we have in our tool set, that really measures the individual's sort of natural and instinctive behavior, how they work potentially under pressure. Are they more relational? Are they more results? And sort of how do they make decisions? And that really is sort of the experience that individual goes through with this assessment we call natural behavior. And really it gets very deep around sort of understanding the factors, we call them. There are 64 of them that are measured in natural behavior, and that's really that starting point of learning natural behavior for you as a leader and for your team. So here we have what we call the iceberg slide, and it really helps understand sort of that behaviors that are below the surface. We may not even understand them ourselves if we have them, because they're so innate into us in that natural instinctive behavior, that level 1 behavior, we call it. Level 2 behavior is really around learned behavior, the things that we've learned in our life, our experiences, our jobs, relationships. They're the things that we call level 2 behavior. Level 1's natural and instinctive, and if any of you are familiar with the work that Daniel Kahneman has done, it's really around that system 1, level 1 behavior, or system 2, level 2 behavior. It's things that we don't even understand why we do it, but we do it. And so you as a leader or an individual leading a team, if you're sort of hardwired a certain way and don't have sort of that more sort of advanced level 2 behavior, you might actually be sort of operating sort of in this zone of like being very punitive or sort of instructional or maybe too high level. Lots of different things that can happen with natural behavior as part of that. So I think we are ready for a poll question.
Just keep the blood pumping this morning. Are you currently using a behavioral assessment tool? Just get a feel for where everyone is at the moment, and we'll continue on. And a good cross-section here, and a quick share of the results. So not yet, which makes sense. However, to our experience, we've seen where people do kind of have maybe an off-cuff way of determining, you know, that first impressions mean something still. It's just a matter of the accuracy and validity of those insights and how they're applied. But but to have a full-on assessment tool kit in place, maybe not so much at this moment.
Yeah, and if anybody has taken Myers-Briggs or any of the DISC is another one, it'll give you, that is a behavioral assessment. So if, and there are a number of them in the market, why we sort of advocate for natural behavior, it's that really that understanding of how a person's naturally wired. And then you can do some things really around sort of education experience to really elevate that level 2 behavior. So thank you, Tripp. And we talked a little bit about earlier around that natural and instinctive line. So if you've ever worked with an individual and they have this very natural instinctive ability, and they sort of, if a situation happens and they react very differently than what they usually show up as, that's an indication of natural behavior that's sort of showing up. It's so, they're sort of hit with something that sort of they weren't expecting, and they will revert to that natural instinctive line. The learned behavior, which is represented on this chart here, shows that you can actually go above or below your natural instinctive behavior just by sort of your education, your experiences, but always remember in times of sort of increased business, that things are hectic, pace is faster, people will sort of almost like abandon that learned behavior and fall back to that natural instinctive behavior. That's why it's important to know what that starting line is for every individual that you work with on your team. And this chart here shows natural instinctive behavior as level B, you can see here. But I want to talk a little bit about level C is really around your competencies. So you as a leader, and many of you have been through leadership programs or you've had some experiences of that, you've got work experiences. So that's the competencies that we all come with. We sort of have some natural abilities to expand that. The natural and instinctive behavior, we measure it based on how relational somebody is and how results somebody is. So you can see here, based on the in the yellow and then the green here, that's your natural and instinctive talents. And that's what we uncover in that business DNA natural behavior discovery. The level A behavior is character and integrity, because we get asked this often. How do you measure that? And you really can't measure it. It's sort of somebody's value system, maybe how they were raised, some things that happen in their life that develop, and maybe their mentors in life help sort of shape those experiences around character and integrity, because you can't measure that in an assessment. What you can do, you can see how much somebody likes to take risks and how much somebody maybe not likes to take risk, and maybe their decision making, but that really is independent of the sort of character and integrity. We've talked a little bit about natural behavior, sort of that natural behavior, and what will score after somebody's completed the discovery are what we call 10 profiles. There'll be one of 10. Every individual will have a very different sort of behavioral insights because there's no two that'll ever be exactly the same, which is quite interesting. But the folks that are actually on the left side of this wheel, starting with influencer, are more results focused, and they actually wake up sort of at the beginning of the day thinking about sort of what they need to do, what they need to get done, things that they've got on their task list, a number of things, but they sort of focus on the things that they need to do and less about the people. Not that they don't think about people, because they do, but it's sort of comes secondary to sort of thinking about results. The folks over here on the right are what we call very relational. And the degree that it gets a little bit more intense around the community builder, they actually think people first. It sort of comes to mind, maybe family, sort of things that they need to do to nurture their family, and then they think about results. So you can see there almost sort of an interesting sort of setup between the 10 profiles, that more results, more relational. And in any organization, you really need a makeup of both of sides of that wheel, because if you have more results on one side in your team and there are ways to measure that, you may actually be lacking in your client-centered side of the business. You may not be attracting new clients. You may actually be sort of alienating some of your clients because they just don't feel valued by the firm. So it's important to have a mix of the relational people. But on the token side, if you have a firm that's made up of mostly relational people, which can be great for client satisfaction, for client service, but maybe your projects aren't getting done on time or your deliverables aren't done. So that's why it's important to have a makeup of both sets of relational and results-focused individuals on your team. And we'll talk a little bit later around how you can actually influence and sort of work to make sure that you've got a balanced team. Who are you working with and how do you know them? This is a question that, as you're getting ready to hire a new team member, what do you look for to balance out the team? I think that's sort of the approach most business owners take. But it is important when you're building relationships for the team that you know how to adapt communication to the other person's needs. It's showing there in point 1. And this comic strip is pretty interesting and one that we use. In the individuals saying, the consulting firm says, that I lack warmth. Just turn up the temperature of the thermostat. That's sort of an external sort of thinking this person has that, they think of themselves maybe as relational, and they're not. They're not warm. They're sort of seen as very direct and sort of to the point, and sometimes people need a little different sort of atmosphere. So, you build your culture around sort of the people that you hire. So it's important to know, who your team members are, how relational, how results, to get to the best results. Point number 2, be aware of how your strengths and struggles can impact the other person. This is one of our favorite things to do when you have two people, especially when they're opposites. So you've got one very hardcore on results and one very focused on relationships. They probably have a lot of miscommunications that go on between them. So if you understand how they're wired naturally, it can lead to a lot better breakthroughs with the individuals and the team. And then number 3, building transparency. I can't sort of emphasize enough how trust is really critical to this process when you're actually working with teams, and whether you're using behavioral insights or not. I don't think that really comes into play, but when you build a trustful environment with your team, when you sort of have their back, when you're actually watching out for them, coaching them along the way when they're making mistakes or they're sort of off base on something, but it helps build trust. And being able to open yourself up in building trust is really critical. Sort of this knowing me, knowing you strategy is important. Because when you actually admit sort of, hey, I don't know everything, or, I need a little bit of help here, it builds trust. And then number 4, ask for honest feedback. Sort of use that continuous feedback loop. You can really grow as a leader or an individual on the team when you do that. If you sort of build these 4 principles into your building relationships, and I don't care how relational you are or how results focused you are, if you sort of use these 4 points, you can really lead to that people really see you as being a team member and really seeing that sort of the overall arching to build sort of this business that you have. And then when we build our team performance model, we build it using sort of these techniques around communication, around commitment, around understanding, acceptance, respect. They all really do lead to the trust, which leads to team success. And the reference here around diversity on the team doesn't speak to race at all. It's really around how sort of the behavioral insights of your team. How relational is the team member? How results focused is the team member? When you build sort of a diverse team of the makeup, you're going to have a much better experience. But it takes work. Just knowing that somebody's a community builder or somebody's a strategist isn't going to be enough. It's really understanding how effective they can be in the organization. How do you actually work with them so you get sort of that team performance? It's really important to know. And with sort of the natural behavior discovery, we outline what we call behavioral awareness. and it really speaks to the strengths and the struggles of an individual, and we all have them. Our belief is that if you have a strength that's overplayed, it truly becomes your struggle. So it's important to know that. My two struggles, I'm spontaneous, which is a strength because I can be sort of react in a moment when I need to, but the struggle can be I'm not planned enough. So it's important to know what your strengths are, and that if it's overplayed, it can become the struggle. And each one of us would have sort of the understanding of what our two top behavioral factors are, which would sort of show the strengths and the struggles. And then when we're working with team members, if you recall from the 10 profiles, there was one profile type we call an adapter. And they have very mid-range scores. They tend to be very flexible in the factors. They can actually move pretty easily between results and relational sort of work, but they may not be consider themselves great at anything because they can do a lot. But that really speaks to that mid-range scores. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the scoring of how we do that, the intensity of it a little later, but I just wanted to give you some understanding of, we really try to, strengths-based company is you really focus on the strengths and less about the struggles, but just realize they're there. With that, I think we have another poll question being teed up.
Thank you, Leon. Just keeping things moving right along. At this point, with what we've covered, do you understand how natural behavior impacts personality and decision-making? Fairly straightforward. We'll let everyone have a chance to get a shot at this and see where we fall. I'll share those results. So pretty much keeping everybody on point. This is great. Everyone's following along very well.
Excellent. So interesting that the 13% that responded no, don't be too alarmed, because it probably is just sort of an understanding of that natural behavior, that very natural instinct of why I do things. And if each of you on the call could think, of a time when you did something you didn't even know why you do it, you just sort of do it, it's automatic decision making. That sort of points to natural instinctive behavior. So when you're working in a team and that sort of manifests itself sort of with the team member, you don't even know why you do it, it just does. It's really helpful to understand sort of what your own strengths are in those struggles. So, and if anybody's interested in finding out a little bit more, I think we have an opportunity for you to actually complete the natural behavior discovery yourself, go through that process. It can be quite interesting, and you learn a lot about yourself. So please, there'll be an opportunity at the end of this presentation to take that. So the necessary ingredients for a healthy team, we talked a little bit about that, the diversity of the makeup of how relational, how results-focused the team is. You really want to have sort of the mission, the commitment, the corporate values, opportunity, loyalty. There's obviously has to be policies and discipline around sort of how you work as a team. Sort of that's the baseline of how we work. But then the differentiators for a team, for a healthy team, are the talents. Because if you had all people that were very results focused, very planned, sort of, just did all the same things, you wouldn't have sort of the ability to do other things, about being responsive on other things. The motivations, the ideas, the interests, the needs, and the styles, you want those to be different. You really do want sort of that blend of the 10 profiles. So that's why it's important to just distinguish between what should be important as the same around sort of the commitments and how people are treated, the policies. Everybody should be treated based on the same policies. But those differentiators are very important, and I would speak mostly around those talents and motivations, because that's where you're going to get really that team performance, is when people are using their strengths to the optimization of the team. You can really learn how to be able to do that and really help an individual grow in their abilities. The benefits of actually having team diversity really speaks here to, just going back, to understanding the team members, how they naturally do things differently. That can be great. So a lot of times you get somebody that, I can do it better than somebody else. But if you give somebody the opportunity to do something that they're just naturally wired to, they might actually do it better, believe it or not. It's quite interesting. Then 2, hiring the right team, the right talent to perform in the team. It's very important. You can literally see a team, so the results, find out where the gap is. When you make your next hire, be able to hire the right person for that right role. Minimizing team stress, it's really important, that people feel when they come to work, that they really feel that they're operating in their zone, they're operating to the extent of their ability, and minimizing sort of the punitive side of what we do to get things done. Sometimes that can be sort of a culture sort of norm, and that's important to make sure that we realize that things happen at fast-paced, things happen, you're going to go to your natural instinctive behavior, but try to minimize that team stress. And some of it is through team meetings, through just understanding each other's styles. Number 4, managing the team members uniquely. And even though sort of policies and discipline should be consistent, everybody sort of responds differently. Their motivations may be differently. Asking them sort of what's important to them can lead to that trust that I talked about earlier. But you're all trying to move to the common goal of the deliverable. And then identifying, unlocking blockages. I focus a lot of attention on that even with our team. Whenever there's a blockage, and a blockage is identified by sort of, somebody's having a tough time getting through something, it's taking a little bit longer, maybe the systems aren't working, stepping back and really evaluating, is it a blockage that, it's just another team member doesn't understand the work, or is it sorry about that, not sure why that
technical difficulty.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Keeps it interesting.
Yeah, covered. Okay, here we are. So identifying those blockages, sorry about that, folks, making sure that very efficient execution goes on. And I'll use an example with blockages. If somebody's very spontaneous and sort of maybe they haven't done the planning part to the work because it's just not natural for them, you can literally lead to other blockages for other team members. But if you insert a team member that's a little bit more planned, you get more of that successful execution. So that's what I speak to using behavioral insights in the team. And then number 6, building that open communication within the team for allowing creative sort of conflict. And a lot of people sort of shy away from conflict, just a word, but I think it can be very healthy. And I'm not talking about, that people are sort of misbehaving or sort of yelling, but when you actually have a difference with the team, actually talk about it, making sure that there's discussion, dialogue around it, and that at the end of it, you sort of come to a consensus, this is what we're going to do, because you can have a lot of learning from that. Because somebody that's high questioning, somebody that maybe is more skeptical, they learn by asking questions, but it can appear for some team member that's more trusting that it's an interrogation. It's just important to be able to sort of distinguish between people are trying to really understand. And you can really lead to very open communication. Number 7, building higher levels of team engagement for retention. You'd be amazed at when people feel, they're part of the team, they feel engaged, they're working in their strengths. You lead to much better team performance. You see that consistently with team members. And then number 8, matching teams and customers for improved service. We do a lot of work with matching sort of individuals with sort of a client, even if it's a sales process, using behavioral insights. It's quite remarkable and leads to better sort of client engagements, much better sort of client experience, and get high marks in customer satisfaction. So I'm just refreshing this here again around the profiles. I mentioned earlier this adapter is that somebody that has more moderate scores, and each one of these could have fairly moderate scores, but you'll see that the folks over here on the left are going to be more results focused, and the folks over on this side will be more relational. So I just wanted to orient you one more time sort of on how the slides work in the natural behavior discovery.
And actually, just to address the question that we've fielded so far, that in the pie chart, do we consider or we find that the struggle tends to be a slice directly opposite the strength? And there's certainly some idea that say a strategist that we're looking at here at the far left versus a community builder or a relationship builder, that would be the furthest 2 points of the spectrum, and would require the most work to be able to work together. But it's identifying those differences, and it's identifying what that gap is, and then what the insights and what the communication is, what the strategy is, then to help bridge that gap for those individuals, because they both have important parts of a given team, and both contribute and participate equally as well, depending on what the project is, or the client engagement, or what the end goal is. So the value is there, but there might be some headbutting going along the way, which is expected, and actually in a transparent and open environment is welcome and expected.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Trip. That's great sort of readout.
And also then, sorry, and then we also have a good poll question,
okay.
Just to keep things moving along, is just a quick refresher on what we've seen so far. How can you build sound relationships? And we've got a number of options to choose from, and we'll see what everyone's thought may be. And we're good with a good cross-section of folks there, so we'll take a quick share, and kind of all over the board, which is fine. Each and every one of these has their own importance as part of that process. Actually, it is all the above, but some may gravitate towards one versus another, but know that they all come into play when building a team and building a relationship. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, that's excellent. So just covered that slide, and one other point around that strategist and community builder that Trip was mentioning. Just to give you some understanding, that strategist is somebody that's going to be very results focused. So they usually have a high need for information. They can appear to be very sort of skeptical in the line of questioning, the interrogator, as I mentioned, especially to the community builder. A community builder sort of sees themselves, or they are, sort of building a community. They tend to be more patient, so they can be polar opposites. They really understand the insights of how they work better, those strengths that we talked about. They can really help offset some of the struggles that each one of them would have. And the struggles for a strategist would be they tend to be, or they perceive to be, too direct, sort of impersonal. We saw the slide earlier with a woman saying to turn down the temperature or turn up the temperature. She lacked warmth. That's typically what a strategist, they're just not real relational. It's sort of their makeup. Doesn't mean that they're bad people at all. They're great in the workplace, but just understanding that can be important. Versus the community builder, people see them as sort of so relational, and sort of maybe they don't see them getting a lot done, sort of on the plan side. So it just sort of shows the difference between them. And if they have an understanding of how they work together, you can have great breakthroughs with this team. I'm going to introduce sort of the topic, and I'm sure most of you have heard this, sort of a team structure around forming, storming, norming, and performing. And this is sort of the stages that teams go through, and it's quite interesting. I've been working in this for a number of years, but whenever you've worked on a team that's coming together, and it might be sort of initiative that the company is doing, or it's just a new team that you're bringing on board, this forming is where you identify the team member. They come, they sort of identified who's needed on the team. Everybody comes together, and it's the forming stage. And everybody's, for the most part, playing nice because everybody wants to get along. It starts in that very, giving people sort of the latitude to be who they are, understanding. But it quickly changes to this stage called storming. So you don't stay in forming long, especially if it's the same team members, but you go into this phase of storming. And storming is where you, literally by the name of it, that says that there's tension. It just means that you're trying to figure out other people's motives, their motivation, their strengths, possibly their struggles, and people can feel overpowered. People can feel that they move to sort of I can't succeed. So there's a lot of different things that happen in storming, and teams can actually stay in storming for the duration of the team, which is actually real inefficient, and you will never get to the 70% of team performance staying in storming. It's impossible. And it's important to identify that when you're a leader, if your team's in storming. It just means that there's inner conflict going on, and you've really got to take sort of it upon yourself to understand how to get that team into the norming stage. And the norming stage is really where the team is understanding the behavioral strengths and how they can actually work together. Sort of, if you think about rowing a boat, everybody's sort of rowing for the most part in the same direction. In storming, people are really being resistant. You might actually have some performance issues that have to be coached. There's a number of things that can happen in storming. You want to get your team to the norming stage, and it can be really through that, just understanding, building those sound relationships that we talked about earlier. So if you're in norming, that's great. I would say that you get a high level of performance in norming. It just means that people understand each other. They may not be working at optimal performance, because that's really what performing is. That's where you can actually 1 + 1 = 3. And if any of you have ever worked on a high-performing team, you know what that looks like. Everybody's really sort of understanding the different strengths of the individuals, where people should, be placed for the maximum performance. And that's where deliverables, budget, timelines, all that come, on time. And that's really, it's not easy to get to the performing stage, but it can be done. And you can use behavioral insights to really help you understand a common language to be able to get to that performing stage. But recognize, even if you're at the performing stage, if a team member leaves or you have a new team member that's coming on board, you automatically go back to the forming stage. So it's continuous. Now, because there's already, if you've been in performing, and you've got a team member that's coming on board, it may go back to forming, and there'll be a little bit of storming. Just understand you can move through the cycle pretty fast if, again, you're using behavioral insights, using this leadership sort of approach and building a culture of performance, that people really understand their role and how they impact it. And I will say a large number of teams stay in storming. It's really unfortunate. And a lot of people, everybody has a responsibility in the team. I think that's an important part to articulate, you as the leader with anybody on your team, is that everybody has a part of the success of the organization. When people feel disempowered, that's why they go into storming and stay in that stage. So we'll focus a little bit more attention on those in the next webinar around sort of each sort of attribute of the forming, storming, norming, and performing. But I will say that when you're selecting your team in the forming stage, it's really important that you make sure that you've got the right level of behavioral insights, how relational, how results. In some teams, there may be a blend. You need a little bit more of the results-focused people because it's more of a technical team. But if you're in customer service and it's a project, you want to make sure you've got more of those relational skills. So it's really important to be intentional when you're forming a team and trying to get them through the cycle of the storming, the norming, performing. You can't bypass any one of these stages, but you may never reach performing if there's not more sort of intentional sort of work done on the leader's part. And it takes everybody to be part of this. Make it fun, make it enjoyable. You can really sort of do yourself and your team and your company a service by actually understanding these 4 different phases and how your team sort of ranks. And I always challenge a team when I go to work with a team is, where do you see yourself on this scale? And I would say that probably 90% of the teams score themselves maybe norming, but they're probably border on storming at times. They really haven't yet perfected the ability to get to a strong norming phase and certainly working on performing. So just maybe do a little self-review of where you might fall in that scale. I think it's important to do it and be honest with yourself. Okay. And then teams in that forming stage, they resist the urge to hire someone just because they have the faults and the basic skills. That's really important. Run a team report. That's where you're going to find out sort of how the strength of the team, how they balance out on their strengths. And then, if you're an advisor, have sort of, if you're acquiring a firm, make sure that, everybody in this firm has actually completed the assessment as well. It can be great. Depends on whatever stage your team is in when you're doing the forming. Really understand who you're bringing into the team. And then I want to talk a little bit about a book that I read back in 1999. It was sort of my first entree into leadership, and it was Marcus Buckingham's book, First Break All the Rules. And it's a dated book at this point, at 99, but it has some amazing techniques when you're building your team. And I'm sort of abide by this in everything I've done in my career since then around understanding who you're working with. When you do these, sort of capitalizing on the strengths of the team, really understanding and sort of celebrating the differences, that there's shared traits, there's complementary, it needs trust. Trust leads to unity for the team, but you definitely need to understand yourself, understand others, accept and sort of build that trust and seek to understand who they are. Because great managers offer this advice: focus on the other person's strengths and manage around their weaknesses. Just don't focus on them. You can actually do your team a huge service by doing that. And this book also refers to people don't leave companies, people leave their managers. It's pretty critical. So if you've got an individual that's left your team, I think there's always, sometimes it's relocation, a lot of different reasons, but if somebody's left your team, it's important to do a little self-review. Did they leave because they just didn't feel like they had the setup to be a successful team member? But I really recommend reading First Break All the Rules. It's a great read, and it ties in to what we talk about, natural and instinctive behavior. And we have sort of the 6 pillars of what we call a team performance. So if you're actually moving to that, from the forming and then the storming and the norming and the performing, there are things you can do sort of to help, and these are the 6 stages. The leader review is really understanding who you are, how do you want to build your team. Sort of the team member review, actually spending time with each individual team member, understanding their strengths, sort of what their interests are in their role in the team, how do they see themselves. And then doing the team meeting, and it's really critical, sort of really understanding how the total team is made up and sort of the leveraging of the team. And then team relationships, that's really sort of adapting communication for each team member, how they work together, building mutual respect with each other. And then leader coaching, which I'm a big believer of, that each team member, if you're meeting with them once a week, just really helping reinforce where their strengths are. And then when you're having the tough conversation, maybe they're not meeting some expectations, it's a lot easier to do it when there's not sort of a punitive setup to be able to do it. And then sort of the review process. It's important to have a review, whether it's annual, that's what I've seen most companies do, that people really understand where they are in the organization, and that's usually done on an annual review or maybe a 360. And with that, I think we've got another poll question.
Another poll question, yes. So earlier we asked if you understood how natural behavior affects personality and decision making, but taking that a step further, can you use that natural behavior to understand the different personalities and then apply to team dynamics as we've been discussing so far today? So we'll just get a decent cross-section of responses, and we will close that polling and share the results. And everyone's on board with us today. That's fantastic.
Wonderful.
Means we're doing something
Very
right.
good. Thank you very much. And then the last part of this performance is really around mentoring, team mentoring. I'm a big believer of everybody can be a mentor on the team for each other. You really build a lot of cohesiveness and respect for each other. And when people leave the team, they'll take that experience of what they've had, especially a high-performing team, and they'll take it to some other team, whether hopefully it's in your company. But you really build a team of leaders when you do this process. And now is the time to capitalize on the strengths of your team. If you're not really sure where you are, ask. We really are strong believers of really understanding the behavioral insights, but you can do some great things without even having sort of behavioral insights. Just talking to your team, really understanding where they are on that spectrum of the norming, the storming, the forming, and the performing. So once the behavioral awareness is developed in the team, there are things that you can do to really help enhance the team and keep them in that performance stage. Really understand the succession planning. You as a leader, if another opportunity comes in and you need to make sure that you've groomed somebody to be second in command, it's important to have that succession planning, or for any member of the team. Assimilating new leaders and team members, really the onboarding process is critical, that people really feel they can be successful. Scaling back office to support the growth, making sure that that gets back to the blockages. Point number 3 is around if there are blockages in the back office, make sure that that's sort of done right by the right people, because it really can hold back an organization. We're big believers of the 7-point change management sort of rollout. That it takes 7 points of communication, whether it's verbal, written, video, whatever medium that you have, that you really want to get people through, the change, with the change management approach. It's really important because people learn differently. And then number 5, which is pretty critical, establish goals and priorities, set them up front, making sure that people really understand what they're achieving to, because people really want to perform, and when the goals are clearly outlined in those priorities, and those priorities can shift, but it's important just to let them know so you can really use these behavioral sort of insights to move to that team performance stage. I think we have another poll question.
One last question here as we get close to tidying things up. Just get an idea of other behavioral topics you might be interested in learning more about. We've got a short list here, but there's an opportunity as the survey to maybe put in something a little more up your alley. And so we'll let a few folks respond on here, but also know that the current session that we're on is a 4-part series that we're having registered for. Whether you're able to make it or not, you'll be copied in on the results of the rest of the series, the recordings, the presentations, and certainly open to questions and comments as we continue to roll this series out, and we cover the reporting that goes into this. We cover the other stages of team development, as well as getting into learned behavior beyond the natural behavior. But we can discuss all that later on. For now, I'll close the poll and share the results and get a decent. Affecting corporate culture seems to be pretty big. Obviously, you either want to maintain the one that you have, or maybe things have gotten a little toxic and you're trying to course correct. And that's all based on behavior, and it's all based on an individual basis of the talents that you have already in-house and how to utilize those for cultural change. And leadership development, another big topic that between leadership and entrepreneurship, cover that from a behavioral standpoint as well. So I'll let the process continue, and we'll just keep on.
Right. And getting back to that corporate culture, because that was one of the higher on the poll, we just released a blog on sort of Uber, which you've been following that very closely. Sort of a big shakeup in the Uber management, and it's a great blog to read if you actually go out to DNA Behavior blog, because it really speaks to the importance of building a strong culture. And our research team did a great job of that blog, really showing the importance, because it can really derail a company, and it really always starts at the top, but every team member has a responsibility to sort of help in the shaping of the culture. There's a couple things here we just wanted to make note of. There's a resource tour here, great information for business DNA and products. And then there's actually a link to the blog site that I just mentioned. So our focus is really around natural behavior, really the talents. Those natural instinctive behaviors stay very stable over time. So whether you're 18 or 80 and you're taking this, it's going to stay very consistent. Most other tools have sort of a blend of situational learning that's part of it, that level 2. So just understand sort of where you are at that point in time. And then the natural behavior discovery really is that reliable predictor of how a person's going to consistently perform over long term. If you have somebody in the wrong role, that it's going to show up somewhere, and it's important to know who your team is and are they in the right roles. And then a little bit about DNA behavior. We've been around since 2001. We talk about the tailor-made suit for every client using validated psychometric platform. And there's our Know, Engage, and Grow is our methodology on delivery of service. And then just a little bit about the company. We are in 123 countries. We have 11 different languages translations. And then it's an independently validated assessment, with over 100 years experience. And we measure 64 behavioral factors. We didn't get into that today. It'll be in one of the future 4-part series. But those 64 factors are really what help shape that natural instinctive behavior. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next webinar. And then Tripp has put our July webinar focus will be sort of on the storming phase of team development. And I believe that is scheduled for July 18th. And so those of you already on the email or on this webinar will get that invitation. So I believe it's the 18th of July. So with that, we do have the information here. You will get a copy of this PDF report. There is a trial link if you do want to take the trial. I'd encourage you to do that. If any of you are on the call have completed natural behavior in the past, it won't let you take it again because you're in the system. But if you want your results, workplace operations report, we're happy to send that to you. Our blog site is here. Encourage you to read the blog, especially the one on Uber. And then you can follow us on LinkedIn. We have a Financial Personality Insights pay group, and then find us on Twitter.
And before we wrap things up, an opportunity for some Q&A, and we have a couple already queued up. First off, based on some comments that we made earlier on in the presentation, that we mentioned we can't measure values, but does that mean assessing which values are more naturally inherent in a person? Does this mean to say which values are more naturally inherent? Because I think values have more to do maybe with the results of the behavior that the person is exuding, or a judgment, for lack of a better term, of what somebody else places as important based on what that person is exuding in their behavior or in their engagement.
Yeah, and I would say that values, because we don't measure values, but it can be sort of that, this is natural instinctive behaviors, really programmed by the time you're 3 years old, so it's very much who you are as an individual. But your values are shaped sort of through that family relationship that you're born into and sort of live with, your peers that you're growing up with, your schooling. All those things sort of shape the values of sort of what's important to you.
And that'll come out more as part of the learned behavior aspect that we will dive into a little bit later. And then the other part, and the other question that we have is, in the pie chart that we had, the 10 traits that we reviewed, do we find that the struggle tends to be the slice directly, well, the opposite straight, or actually, let me back up. Do we run across people whose two greatest, highest scoring strengths within themselves are opposite slices? and if it does that, tend to help, utilize both ends of the spectrum, or hurt because they may be at war with each other.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
It's very interesting, and believe it, I have seen some profiles that sort of do have sort of opposite. It's very interesting when I interview that individual. They have some inner struggles typically that they're in conflict with that. And it typically, you see that in some profile types, like the stylish thinker can be one of those profiles that has a little bit of more complexity around it. So they probably do a little bit more behind the scenes sort of just processing than you might see on the surface.
Or even the adapter can be
and the adapter
conflicted
as well,
because they're right down the middle of
yeah.
all those things, and so they may not necessarily know what direction to go in a given situation. What strength that's really going to be helpful and effective, and therefore, that may become a struggle.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
how to engage other folks. They're so literally adaptive to the other person's sensibilities that they kind of get lost themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question, but it will, you see it rarely. People really fall along the lines in the profiles, pretty strong in the behavior, and it depends on the intensity of their profile. Honestly, that's one of the things, that's what makes it really unique. When you see not all initiators are created equal, not all community builders are created equal. It's quite interesting, and that's what makes it fun to sort of explore those behavioral insights in the intensity. So great question. Thank you. I hope you'll join us on the next webinar that we have.
I think that kind of concludes things for today. We're able to give people about 5 minutes of their day back and appreciate their time. Again, with this being recorded, once it's cleaned up and ready, we will release that to everyone that registered and joined us. And then as well as there's a survey that will pop up immediately after, and we appreciate any of the feedback you can offer up, as well as then send out our guide for it's some off-cuff insights using some of our platform, but it enables you to apply some of that learning and some of that thinking to your day-to-day.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.